Well, welcome everybody. It is 5 past, and I'm sure some people may join us as we begin our introductions. I'm Robin Dowling from the University of Sydney, so good morning from me. And as is customary in Australia, I'd actually like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land upon which I am sitting this morning, and that's the Wongal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respect to elders past and present as for the morning. I think it is, I'll introduce our speakers in a moment, but the focus of today is in this final Global Urban Seminar series is the increasing complexity of cities. I mean, cities have always presented us as urban scholars and urban planners with challenges. But those challenges have become much more pronounced over the past 10, 15 years. So the climate emergency, for example, will have profound impacts on how urban dwellers live and where they live. The COVID-19 pandemic has involved considerable disruptions to the employment concentration cities, where we work, how we work, do we work, etc., and the importance of public spaces. And overlaying across those really quite disruptions, if you like, to cities and city dwellers, excuse me, is movements for social justice and recognition that challenge who urban policy is for, how do we do urban policy, and what in fact is urban policy. So I'm really quite pleased that we have 3 eminent scholars here with us this morning to offer their reflections on some of these concerns. And I will introduce them as we proceed. But I just would like to start with a little bit of housekeeping, as we're joining from all around the world and we're becoming quite familiar with this. So we'll have 3 presentations, each of about 10 minutes. We would appreciate questions at any time. To ask a question, we encourage you to use the chat function, which you all would, which is available to all of you. It would be helpful to us if you could include your name and affiliation with your question, so we get a sense of who it is, or what is our audience, and what community are we speaking with at the moment. You might also like to ask a question live during the question and answer period after the 3 presentations. If you'd like to do this, then raise your hand using the raising hand function in Zoom as well, and then myself or someone else will call upon you to answer your question. And just quickly, if you wanted to enable or disable the closed captioning feature, you click on the CC button, which is at the bottom of your screen, and captions are in English only. And I can confirm that we've enabled captions before we begin if you like. Finally, if you're posting about today's event on Twitter, which we would love you to do, or on LinkedIn, there's use a hashtag urban2021 would be fantastic. So that's it for me from housekeeping. And I would like now to start with introduce our first speaker, who's Professor Crystal Legacy from the University of Melbourne, also in Australia. Crystal has published widely on topics of transport politics, urban conflict, citizen participation, plan making, urban governance. And her current research is on urban transport politics, where she's working on really trying to understand how we reframe the role of citizens in transport planning in an urban age. She's done a whole heap of work around autonomous vehicles and other transformations in planning that might entail. And she also has an interest in planning theory, and in planning pedagogy. And I think that might be what she will be speaking about today. So I'm just going to hand straight over to Crystal. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Robin. Let me just share my screen, and let's keep our fingers crossed that this happens with considerable ease. See here. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Terrific. Thank you for that confirmation. Well, thank you. And before I begin, let me pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land upon which I'm speaking with you today, and that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I use this acknowledgement as a reminder that this land that I occupy today has never been ceded. In 2019, the critical feminist Australian geographer Natalie Osborne essayed the following, and I quote, "We lost the war, and there's more loss to come, but there are still possible worlds, still possible shared futures, still possible cities, and some of them are worth having. These still possible worlds, the work of imagining them, prefiguring them, breathing and singing life into them is the feminist urban praxis that feels available to me, and I offer it to my companions and comrades in political depression," end quote. Evoking the work of Donna Haraway in her call for still possible cities, Osborne lays bare the challenges faced by critical scholars, especially those like many of us here today who are teaching in times of complex and intersecting crises. As the early hours of this decade were greeted by a devastating bushfire in Australia, Australia's Commonwealth government continued governing without a credible climate policy. It's hard not to feel a sense of political depression of the kind described by Osborne, even as tens of thousands of young people marched in 2019 around the world, and again more recently in Australia, signaling increased global grassroots-led solidarity for climate change action. Only weeks later, as the fires extinguished in Australia, a new crisis was afoot, a global health crisis triggered by COVID-19. This crisis would amplify existing social, economic, and spatial divisions and transform public places into desolate, silent, lonely, and divided spaces to be avoided. The police-led lockdown of public housing estate residents in Melbourne during our second wave here provided an unsettling reminder that while the cries from many in elite positions in our societies suggest that when it comes to fighting this virus, we are all in this together, the lived experience of this time is unequal and solidarity is tenuous. The crisis before us have created a crossroads. In a recent piece in The Guardian by Rebecca Solnit, she provokes, and I quote, "One of our main tasks now, especially those who are not sick, not frontline workers, and are not dealing with other economic or housing difficulties, is to understand this moment and what it might require of us and what it might make possible." As a critical urban scholar, what this moment rendered visible to me is that even now, as the virtual scapes become our teaching and learning environments, connection remains vital. These crises ground our unique and common struggles as we experience them. In the moments of teaching and learning exchanges with our students, it is possible to expose the structures and systems of politics that give life to inequality as we see it before us and feel it within us. Questioning the role of planning has played in these systems can help move teaching from the technical and instrumental towards the more human endeavor grounded in different ways of knowing and experiencing urban planning. In search of epistemologies of connection, urban scholars have looked to the work of Joan Tronto and other broader ethics of care literature. Writers such as Ingi John, Sophie Bond, Jewel Arth, Ilan Wiesel, Wendy Steele, and Donna Houston engage with ideas of caring and caring with, suggesting that it possesses the power to support new solidarities and shift or even somewhat optimistically transform the institutional cultures of planning. If they emerge, these new solidarities can breathe collective energy into a profession that has been politicized under neoliberal regimes of power. As Christina Grange writes, these regimes of power have compromised the planner's ability to be fearless in their work. Challenging the planning establishment as a planner practicing in the system as it is currently designed comes with risks. And these risks have been described more recently by people like Libby Porter and Ananya Roy. And breathing life into a critical practice requires high levels of courage by individuals. It also requires the establishment of a community of practitioners. And to move towards a critical practice requires new ways of performing planning, new ways of thinking from our planning practice, and alternative ways of being in our practice. A powerful illustration of this shift is presented through the work of Patricia Wilson. Her new book, The Heart of Community Engagement, Practitioner Stories from Across the Globe, turns the work of the planner inwards with enlightening reflections on the many ways planners are changed by and transformed through their practice. Wilson, along with co-authors Elizabeth Walsh and Alan Bush, describe participatory practices as grounded in a quote-unquote collective practice that is emergent and cannot be predicted or controlled, and is both intentional and incidental. The conditions being set are ones predicated on what they describe as thrivability and the capacity to cultivate genuine, caring relationships with others, describing this as an essential emancipatory practice. So in her engagement with Wilson's book, Leonie Sandercock writes, and I quote from Leonie, "All practitioners would do better work if they put as much effort into cultivating these ways of being, along with cultivating and evolving our ways of knowing and doing." So Sandercock goes further, arguing, and again I quote, "Our students and emerging planners are craving this. They're hungry for this, and they're growing increasingly impatient with the planning establishment. We're still being stuck in the 20th century techno-Cartesian worldview," end quote. The cravings our students have will only be heightened by the crisis of 2020 and 21. Even the most privileged of our student cohorts are experiencing immense grief and anxieties about their futures, many for the first time. And returning to Osborne's provocation, I consider whether a critical pedagogy for urban planning situated in the concepts of solidarity making and connection formation might be possible. These complex and crisis times have amplified by COVID-19 have brought with it challenging teaching conditions. And I wonder, what can we learn from this moment which we can bring into our future classrooms? It is worth noting that the optimists among us may say that all of this is just temporary, that this grief will pass and a new normal will emerge, and the years 2020 and 21 will be nothing more than a bad year. However, I would argue that to move through this time without recognizing the many new ways connections needed to be forged in teaching and learning is to underplay the role of empathy, compassion, kindness, and even solidarity in the roles they played in sustaining us in this time. And the question is, how can we bring these learnings forward into our future teaching? There are many ways connections were forged and solidarities were made. Looking to my own faculty and considering my own teaching experience, I was energized by the solidarity of domestic students were formed with their international student peers who are unable to make it to Australia due to border closures. Struggling myself as a critical scholar and educator in these times, I drew strength from my students. I was inspired by their active engagement and in local campaigns and their organization of virtual events to reimagine just transport and mobility for a COVID and post-COVID-19 world. In the face of these enormous struggles, they dug deep and they showed me the power of planning when it is done through a consciousness that sees and feels human struggle as something that is present, real, complex, enduring, and cannot be easily fixed by a planning solution. So just finishing up, for many of you here today, the kind of engagement structured on building connections with our students is what you probably already do. And returning back to Natalie Osborne, she posits that perhaps what this period has disrupted are the fixations on planning's ambition of achieving changes in the built environment. What has achieved instead is a set of moments shared in the virtual classroom that could give ground to a moment of awakening for the, as I quote, still possible cities to be found in the cracks in the concrete, in the ruins and wastegapes we find ourselves in, end quote. In this moment, which is demanding so much from us, perhaps we can let it birth new crossroads and reveal the cracks in the concrete that we cannot and must not render invisible through our planning practice. Instead, let these cracks be filled by the embodiment of new possibilities. For learning and teaching, where still possible planning can be crafted through acts of solidarity making in these times of complex struggle, starting in the classroom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Crystal, for that reminder that our students are really quite, they are the future of the city and of planning, and working with that in a hopeful, empathetic way is really quite a telling reminder in the times that we're in. I would also just remind people, if you have a question for Crystal, please put it in the chat and we'll return to it at the end during our question time as well. And so with that, I'm really pleased to move on to our second speaker this morning, which is Jiannan Wu, who is Distinguished Professor and Executive Vice Director of the China Institute of Urban Governance and the Head of Division for Liberal Arts and Social Science at Shanghai Jiao Tong University. He's worked on performance management, reform and innovation in urban governance for quite some time. He served as Vice President of the National Government Performance Management Research Association of China since 2006, and other Chinese academic societies, as well as the General Secretary of Asian Association of Public Administration since 2018. So I'm very pleased that Professor Wu is able to join us this morning, and I'll hand over to him.
Okay, thank you very much, Robin. Thank you. Following the topic, this forum, I'm using the title Governing Complex Urban Regions, Practice from Mainland China. And what I'm talking first is the how to govern Shanghai. Shanghai is a city with more than 24 million people, with just over 6,000 kilometers squares. So the population density is quite large. And here's Shanghai's location. We can say it's at the end of the Yangtze River Delta. And here's Lebong. I guess some of the people may visit here. And when governing Shanghai, I would like to introduce one government innovations since 2018. In Chinese, called 一网通办. Basically, 一网通办 helps to make the city residents more convenient to get things done with local government. We can see right now, since 2018, we have very convenient service that over 83% could finish things online, and over 95% could finish by one stop. And we can also say there are many users, even though the number of the users is larger than the local resident, and also many registered enterprise users. And 一网通办, if we can compare for the traditional ways of service providing many stops and offline, and hereby we can say we can do one-stop service by the government and also no-stop service. So you can access the internet by different ways, by cell phone, by many other ways. And actually, it is the use of the new technologies that re-engineering and restructuring the government structures. We can say from the left to right, we can say the government, the government has changed itself to a very big degree. We have one general portal so that different terminal service devices can be used, and also one administrative centers, and many different departments has been merged into the general portal. Particularly, the philosophy right now in Shanghai municipal government is the government can be touched anywhere and anytime. We can do the online service by different app, and also WeChat, and different, and also offline one service. Particularly, the service satisfaction evaluation has been done every time, each time if each resident want to do. Particularly when facing coping with the pandemic, we can say in China, in Shanghai, the first confirmed cases is 2020, January 20, and the new confirmed cases peaked in January 13. And finally, since as of April 1st, 2020, the mortality rate is very low. And hereby, it is the Yiwang Tongban enhanced the pandemic control to a very big degree. We can say through the Shanghai Post, the information provided for the government decision making for the pandemic control, and also through the Yiwang Tongban digital service platform, the administrative approval procedures has been optimized, and also the cross-region cooperations has been enhanced to a very big degree. So here is a case from Shanghai. Another case from Nanjing is very interesting, that because this case want to deal with the place-citizen relationship in Nanjing. Before this innovation was initiated, the public police service got many big problems, and also low capacities and low citizen satisfaction existed. And the public opening 110, the public 110, just like the 911 in the US, in April 2015, one innovation initiated that maybe we can have a good ways communicated through citizens and the policemen. The basic means to do this is just each citizen, each resident, when they get the police service or law enforcement, you can send a short message to the policeman. And the second, if the recipient, if the receivers say, okay, satisfaction, you can reply 1. Or you don't think it's satisfied, you can reply 3. And or whatever, you can reply 2. And also then when the message was received, the dissatisfied citizens will get a call and was asked to explain why the citizen is not satisfied. And then the information about the causes of dissatisfaction will be recorded. And in 5 days, the electronic worksheet will be go to the policeman, the police station, and the police bureau to share the information. And then in 5 days, the policeman will have to discuss with the service receivers to say, what can you solve the problem if you are not satisfied? And then 5 days later, a call will be made to the dissatisfied citizen for a second evaluation to say, okay, are you satisfied or not right now? If not, then the satisfaction accounts, the satisfaction will be recorded as 20% of the performance of each placement. And after since 2015, after 16 years, there are many messages were sent, and also over 9,000 calls made, and also over 300,000 cases rectified. We can see every minute 13 residents can receive the message from Nanjing Place, ask them, are you satisfied or not? And here is the different satisfaction before and after the messages. And so we can see here from these cases, digital technology improve the place-residents relationships. It is the digital technology that enable the government to be more information accessed and problem rectified. And also it also enables citizens to participate and express their voices. And here is the different stakeholders among the urban government system, the policemen and the citizens. We can say it's the technology use of the technology that make the relationship between place and residents better. So imaging technology matters based on the two cases. The technologies can lower the complexities and the uncertainty of urban regions. And also it is a technology that accelerated the adjustment of organizational structures and optimizing the governance process. And particularly, its technology enables the people-centered digital governance models. We can see the timely services and the government responsiveness has been enhanced to a very big degree and very easily accessed for the public participations. Of course, there are also many challenges when using emerging technologies. For example, how can we balance the outcome and investment of new technologies? And also, new technology may pose new risks to urban governments, particularly the personal privacy on data sharing. So here is my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Wu. It is fantastic that grounded studies of technologies in the city are so important. I know as a smart city researcher myself, there is so much sort of hype and discussion about technology that doesn't really look at how it's being embedded in actual cities. So that was really insightful ways of thinking through technology and addressing some of that complexity that I'm sure there'll be questions for later. So thank you. And thank you to both our speakers so far for speaking, keeping to time perfectly. Which brings us to our last presentation from Professor Graham Wilson, who is the co-founder and director of the Boston University Initiative on Cities. He joined BU in 2007, where he served as chair of Department of Political Science for 5 years from 2010. His areas of specialization are in American politics, comparative politics, business, and interest groups. He's been quite active in urban affairs, serving on the Warwick Commission on directly elected mayors, exploring how do we actually restructure the leadership of cities in the UK in order to achieve policy change and dynamism. And he is our last speaker today, so I will turn over to you, Graham. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us either this evening or in the morning, in the case of our friends and colleagues in Australia. As you've mentioned, I am the director of the Boston University Initiative on Cities, but I'm director of the Initiative on Cities for only another couple of weeks, and my reign of error as director of the initiative will be coming to an end and on the 30th of June. And so I'm turning my mind more away from administrative tasks towards thinking about writing and writing about cities. And I'm particularly concerned this evening with thinking about the way in which city boundaries matter and have consequences, but also are highly porous. And I want to talk about this in two ways. The first is the contrast between what we think of as the city and our legal structures, and then second, in terms of competition between cities. So, as I say, the first point that I wanted to raise is the contrast between how we think of the city as an economic, social, or cultural phenomenon and its legal definition. Notoriously in the United States, the difference between the city as we think of it and the city as a legal institution is considerable. Here's the example of Boston. People in all the area on the map, if traveling and asked in a casual conversation, where are you from, would probably answer Boston. If they back a sports team, it's almost certainly one of the Boston teams. Yet legally, the vast majority of the people who live in this area don't come from Boston, but come from Chelsea, Revere, Newton, Brookline, etc. When a couple of years ago, we were teaching an executive education program, we'd take the participants to the top floor of an unassumingly tall building, only about 9 stories tall, ask them to look around and say how many governments they could see. We thought that the answer was around 45. In San Francisco, put the number of governments in the Bay Area as over 100. What are the consequences of this difference between the city, lowercase, and the city I put in my notes, uppercase, in terms of practical, what are the differences, what are the issues that arise because of the contrast between the city as people experience it and the city as a legal unit? There are obvious practical problems. I was once placed on hold while calling for emergency services for somebody else, while the operator worried about whether I was in Brookline or Boston. The de facto segregation of public schools that some argue is as great now in the United States as before the Civil Rights Revolution is an even more important consequence. In many areas, we know that the problem of the city as a legal unit cannot be addressed without thinking beyond its boundaries. Housing is a prime example. But today I want to emphasize a governance problem, which is the difficulty of establishing democratic accountability for key aspects of urban life. The solution to the fragmentation of US local government has been the creation of bodies that cross city boundaries in their activities. Transportation is a great example in Boston. The subway and buses and commuter trains are under the control of the Massachusetts Bay Transport Authority, the MBTA, which is overseen by the Massachusetts Department of Transport Board of Directors, who are appointed by the governor. And on top of that, in recent years, the governor has also appointed a fiscal management and control board that has had higher authority. In brief, if you're dissatisfied with the T, as we call it, you don't know who to blame. All the local government elected mayors and councillors in the 147 communities served by the T deny that it's their responsibility. The only elected politician who might be held to account is the governor. However, he or she is also accountable to the votes of the cities, towns, and rural areas of the rest of the state, who will feel that already too much money attention goes to Boston, and in the case of rural areas, have been increasingly influenced by what Kathy Kramer calls the politics of resentment. In short, essential urban services are delivered by unelected and complex institutions, in theory accountable to a politician, the governor, who has powerful incentives not to be too sympathetic. I hope this example isn't too Boston-centered for you. They could easily be replicated by references to similar agencies in the region, such as Massport, which controls the airport, and elsewhere, such as New York, New Jersey, the Bay Area in California, etc. There are examples of metropolitan governance in the United States, notably Nashville and Portland, but they're few in number. The second aspect of city boundaries that I want to mention is the competition that inevitably results, and the fact that the boundaries of cities are totally porous in terms of the movement of investment and citizens. Some 40 years ago, Paul Peterson argued that cities were structurally compelled to seek to attract capital and higher income citizens and to avoid being a magnet for poorer cities needing services. Recent examples, such as the undignified scramble by some 250 cities around the United States to be the location for Amazon's second headquarters, HQ2, might be seen to confirm the applicability of Peterson's arguments. In practice, however, recent decades have seen cities in the vanguard of progressive reforms in the United States and perhaps internationally. Many of these reforms, paid parental leave, higher environmental requirements, redistributive tax reforms, might have been expected to attract opposition from business groups, and in fact did so, opposition that often used preemption by state legislatures to constrain urban progressives. In addition to using legal statutory paths to reform, cities also use their power of land use and building permits and as a large-scale purchaser in order to leverage reforms from business. So we might be tempted to conclude that the willingness of cities to advocate and adopt reforms easily caricatured as anti-business was a refutation of Peterson's perspective. The need to compete for investment did not deter cities from promoting progressive reforms. I want to suggest, however, that instead of seeing city reforms as simply a negation of Peterson, we instead see them as evidence of the shifting balance of advantage in the explicit and implicit bargaining between cities and potential investors. As we all know, we've just been through a couple of decades in which cities are cool places where young workers with knowledge economy skills want to live in settings in which the interaction between bright people is more productive than isolation. Not only people, but more importantly for us, corporations wanted to move to the city. If you forgive me yet another local example, General Electric's move from a campus in the Connecticut suburbs to the central city in Boston is a case in point. The forces of agglomeration surprisingly seem to have been strengthened by the rise of the knowledge economy. Cities could afford, therefore, to take a stronger line with business because business felt a renewed need to be in the city. The quality of life for high-skilled workers was a critical need for corporations, not simply finding the city with the lowest taxes and the least onerous regulations. No one yet knows, of course, how COVID will have affected the future of cities. Many suggest that its consequences will be negative. The surge in home prices in suburbs and rural areas in the United States indicates a renewal of interest amongst individual cities in leaving the city, as in the 1960s and 70s. Businesses are likely to continue some options for remote working and are rumored to have come to appreciate the potential savings for them of having their employees work from their kitchen table rather than from a desk in a high-rent office tower. If these rumors are correct, the impact on central cities in terms of lower real estate values, reduced tax revenue, and lost business for related small businesses, restaurants, shoe repair, dry cleaning, etc., could be considerable. Other factors predating COVID may push in a similar direction. For example, the affordability crisis, the growth in the homeless population obliged to live on the street, making previously fashionable cities such as San Francisco or Portland, Oregon, much less attractive to visit, let alone live in. The forces of agglomeration, in short, may be in retreat for a number of reasons. If so, the advantage in implicit and explicit bargaining between cities and investors, cities and high tax-paying individuals may have shifted against cities. This shift may be no more permanent, the shift of advantage towards cities that we have just experienced embodied in the new urbanism. However, its consequences while it lasts may be significant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Graham. I should say that from a Sydney perspective, your discussion of Boston really rang true, where we have a city of Sydney, which is important economically, but very tiny geographically, and only one of 33 local government areas that make up the city, that, you know, the Sydney region, that people think they live in Sydney, but not in this particular part of the city. So it's really important to understand, isn't it, that difference between those legal boundaries and those everyday common sense boundaries of what is the city that we live in. So thank you. That is the end of the formal presentations, at least, and I'm really will enthusiastically take questions. But while some of you will be pondering your questions or putting your hand up, I'm just trying to make sure I can see everyone on the screen to see whether someone's got their hand up. I might pose a quick question to Crystal, if that's okay. Drawing on Jiannan Wu's really interesting talk about the use of technology in relationship building. Admittedly, it was around relationships, which say between the police and the citizenry. I'm wondering what, with your discussion of empathy and hope and relationship building in the city, how you might foresee a role for technology in that.
Oh, it's such a big question, Robin. Thank you. And thank you to the other speakers. What a great session. I've got lots of ideas swirling around. And I think that I don't have, and I don't have the pathway forward. I guess the questions I'm asking are ones around how do we remain connected and committed to democratic spaces? And how do we remain committed and connected to this idea of solidarity and even connection as sort of a human experience? And I was situating that in the context of the classroom, but extending that out to how we might think about that in terms of planning processes and planning and what the roles of planners may play. I think there's a lure and the seduction of technology to always dump to technology as being this whiz-bang wonderful thing that we can just somehow, embed within our existing processes. But I don't think I think it's far more complex than that. And of course it is. But I guess what I was trying to get to with my own provocation and my own thinking going forward is how to continue to do the kind of democratic-based work that we do in the classroom and beyond as planners at a time when there was so much change, pandemics aside, and technology being offered as the pathway forward in terms of how we might do things differently. Like even today here, looking at a series of names, I don't feel as connected as I would if we were all together in a shared space and kind of feeling, each other's energy and each other's sort of ideas in real time. But that's not to say that there isn't something that's really valuable here as well. But that's sort of the questions I've been playing with. I don't think I answered your question, Robin, but that's in part because I don't have an answer yet.
No, it was a thinking question, which doesn't have an answer at the moment. But if I can also then turn it back to you, Jiannan. So the case that you gave of the police and citizen, using technology to sort of, do you think also that, so clearly people were more satisfied with the police after it, but was there any sort of more social outcomes? Was there more trust or other things that followed from that?
Yes, thank you, Robbie, and thank you, Crystal, for the discussion. I think actually the Nanjing's case among the citizens and the replacement is quite unique, because there are many people try to visit Nanjing to learn, and only some of them finally adopt the innovation. The reason I think is there are so many technologies, they merged together to make this case to be accepted by different stakeholders. Actually, when the innovation was initiated at first, many placemen, they don't want to be received the call. However, when they use the video camera to monitor all the process, that is how they give the ticket, how they supply the service, when all the process was recorded, and then they say, okay, here, I would like to get the call. So one of my viewpoints is it is so many technologies, even it's very basic technology, like make a phone call, short message, and also video camera, those get together to make this innovation better. And at the other side, like many other cities, they are trying to use the apps to ask the citizens to raise the performance of the local government. However, we can say many people, they don't want to do that because it's very instantly. When they get the service, you will be asked to do the rating. So I guess not face by face, and in the second day, that make the residents, the service receivers can get the right rating about the service. So I guess Nanjing's case is not cannot be copied everywhere. Only the some kind of the theory, the ideas can be adopted. We can see in different cities, particularly in China, they are trying to ask the citizens to raise the performance. Well, some successful, some not successful. There's one statistic number is 10,000 surveys, only 4 are not satisfied. I can't believe it. I think one of the reasons is use the cell phone, ask the people to do the face-by-face rating. Oh, that's my response. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Which reminds me, just quickly, Graham, Jiannan mentioned learning from each other, and you talked about competition, which has been one of those really important themes in urban studies, but also, you know, in the practicalities of, say, Amazon and, you know, cities competing against each other. What sort of potential is there more potential to learn from and work with rather than work against? You're on mute.
That's a very fair point that you raise, and one of the I just finished writing in what I hope will be an introductory chapter for a book, and at the very end I say, but we must also remember cooperation, and it is on my mind that we have there is cooperation between cities, not only during disasters, but the rest of the time as well. And of course, the international cooperation between cities embodied in things like the C40 is very striking. I believe that the first London, UK climate action plan was prepared with the help of staff on loan from the city of Toronto. So you know, this cooperation can also be international. So I need to acknowledge that, but I think that the competitive forces in terms of attracting investment are generally stronger.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else have comments or questions they would like to make? Matt, you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Robin. What a fantastic discussion. And my question picks up on all of the presenters' talks around the role of citizen engagement, which has been sort of one of those, and resident engagement, I guess, has been one of those questions that has come up in planning for decades now. And I wonder what, you know, it seems to go in pendulum swing from we need more consultation to we need to just get on with it. And I wonder what the lessons that you see from in your regions and in terms of urban governance that the pandemic has showed. Has the pandemic brought out more of an interest in meaningfully engaging communities in decision making, or have you seen in your region and in your research a desire just to move more quickly because the urgency is higher, and maybe the pandemic is being used also as a way to cover up some of the pesky involvement of communities as they try to learn more about projects and push back against things that they see as damaging?
Great question. Crystal, do you want to have a go first?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Maddie, for such a great question. And I'm so cynical and say that it feels like the government has done nothing more than double down and to really harden the boundaries around what counts as citizen participation, certainly around the questions of stimulus and the big build here happening in Victoria. And there's a whole series of real problems around the way we do community engagement and what counts as community engagement. and what voices counts in those spaces and whatnot. So one of the conversations that I'm really interested in having is, and thinking this through with planning students and planners, is looking beyond how we traditionally conceive of participation in the formal sense, and allow ourselves to be open to this idea that citizens can themselves determine what is participation. And we look at it through a set of sort of informal practices in the city, and we go to them. You know, we work with them, and we build solidarities with them, or we allyship with them. Like, you know, we go there rather than set these parameters and have this hard line. I'm doing some research with Janice Berry at the moment, looking at the professionalization of participation, and looking specifically at the role of groups like IAP2, the International Association for Public Participation, which is dictating and may even go as far as to say sort of disciplining practices of participation in terms of how we might do that in infrastructure planning and land use planning and beyond.
Jiannan, did you want to go in comment?
Maybe later.
Okay. So I would say that in the United States, one of the things that we have seen, particularly during the years of inadequate national leadership under President Trump, was, I think, possibly unprecedented attention on governors and also mayors of cities. And I think that the positive side of that was that people in general were confronted with the fact that many mayors are highly skilled, highly effective operators, and that people who hadn't known much about mayors in the past became much more conscious of this. The downside of this for mayors was the extreme pressure which the crisis placed them under. And I think it's perhaps because of that pressure that it seems that a very large number of mayors in the United States who are up for re-election are deciding not to seek re-election. Mayor Bottoms in Atlanta being perhaps one of the most publicized examples. I think that on top of that question of the mayors gaining visibility but also suffering pressure is this question about what COVID might have done to pre-existing trends about cities. We've been from the point of view of urban scholars and people interested in cities generally through this great couple of decades where cities were cool, where they were dynamic, where they were economically seen as where the action is. And yes, you know, we became conscious of inequalities between cities and inequality within cities and of rising problems like affordability. But my worry right now is that the impact of COVID on pre-existing forces, adding to pre-existing forces, will reduce the capacity of city government.
Interesting. Jiannan, did you want to say anything on the issue of participation?
I think the pandemic has changed the cities here to a very big degree because of the when facing pandemic, each stakeholders, they have to face the pandemic together. And it makes the participations better than before. However, after the pandemic, I think things may get back to, recovered to the original situations. We can say in the cities, however, I don't know how to say that.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the questions, isn't it? What is there such a thing as post-pandemic, really? Like, this is, you know, we are going to be living in ways that are shaped by the last 18 months for quite some time, aren't we? And what is a return? So are there we've probably got time for one more question, if there is any. Well, if there are no questions or comments, then let me, excuse me, formally thank our three speakers from Graham Wilson, Crystal Legacy, and Jiannan Wu from their very different locations this morning for a fascinating conversation about what planning, participation, cities, boundaries are going to be in the next little while. And thanks to the School of Cities for hosting, and just quickly thank you to Jay Marsh and Lara Muldoon for all the work behind the scenes. And I believe that this will be available online soonish if others want to listen to it. So thank you and have a good evening or
Good
day.
morning.